Should you kill your ego or should you let it live? If you've spent any amount of time diving into spirituality, you've probably come across the notion of killing one's ego or ego death or dissipating the ego. And the main narrative seems to be that killing your ego off entirely, aka blasting it from existence, is the go-to way to achieve enlightenment. And in this video, I want to take a deeper look into that, right? Understand whether or not something like destroying or killing off your ego is even possible, and if it's even something that you should strive to do in your spiritual journey. And I think the best place to start is just with a simple definition. What even is an ego? The best way that I've had it explained to me is the ego is a self-concept, right? The ego is the concept of I, right? That's literally the Greek translation is the Latin word of I. But it also doesn't physically exist. So it's essentially a mental model that is created by your brain that is helpful because it allows you to interact with the world, right? Whenever you say things like I, me, or my, which is what we use every day as a part of our language, you're essentially using that from your ego. You've probably heard of the concept of somebody having a big ego or an inflated ego, right? So when you think about that, you probably can imagine somebody who is arrogant, right? Who pushes people around, who takes advantage of others, and overall just acts like they are entitled, right? So you would label somebody like that as having a big ego. I actually want to challenge the notion of somebody like that, right? Somebody who is labeled as having a big ego, because I would say almost all the time, somebody who needs to display that sort of front, right? Display that sort of aggression or arrogance, typically that means that they don't have a big ego, they actually have a weak ego, right? Because all that fronting is an effort to cover up whatever insecurities that they're hiding, whatever it is that makes them feel small, right? So they push out, they puff up, they want to make themselves feel big, they want to make themselves feel secure. But underneath all of that defense and underneath all of that protection is a scared child, right? Is somebody who is afraid to confront life. So when people talk about killing the ego, they're really saying that they want to kill off this part of themselves, right? They want to kill off the part of themselves that feels maybe less than, right? Feels less than their higher self, their ideal self, whatever it is that they're striving to do. But this is a trap because at the end of the day, everybody has an ego and everybody actually needs an ego to operate in this world, to interact with others, because if you did not have an ego, then you would not have a personality, right? You would not have self-identity essentially. And it would be impossible to, go out in the world and achieve things and accomplish things and do things. And, maybe that is the end state that some of you are searching for. But I can tell you now that, if you gave up your name, if you gave up your identity, it would be a pretty difficult life to live unless you were a monk living in the mountains alone with no contact with the rest of humanity. So if it's unrealistic to completely kill off the ego, then what can we do with it, right? How can we operate from a place that's not just from our ego? Because that's still a very limited place to operate from. This is where I'd like to introduce the concept of the evolved ego. Because yes, your sense of self can evolve as you grow, and hence your ego can evolve as you grow as well. And the way that I see it is it's always a spectrum between your ego and your higher self, right? Your base ego and your highest self. And what it means to evolve as a person, what it means to evolve spiritually, is slowly starting to bring those two together, where ego essentially becomes your higher self. And what do I mean by higher self? Okay, so the higher self is essentially your soul, right? It is essentially the highest essence of your being, and it is who you were meant to be when you were born. So it represents your highest human potential in this lifetime. And it's what everyone strives for when they think about self-improvement and self-development. You can also think of the ego very similar to the way that you would think of the development of a child, right, into teenage years, into adulthood, right? Each of those stages have very distinct characteristics. And if you compare it to the development of a healthy ego, you'll start to see some parallels, right? Because initially, when we have an ego and our ego is created essentially in our early years based on conditioning, we'll have very primitive drives, right? We'll have very primitive drives of wanting to be successful, right, in the world. financially, relationship-wise, friendships, etc. Now, this is not a bad thing, right? Everyone needs to develop that sort of stability, develop that sort of base so that they can move through life easily. And then as the ego matures, it starts to develop awareness around whether or not it needs certain things in order to be happy, and it starts to develop its own value system. Now, what becomes interesting, right, and this is, I would say, probably the most important part of ego development, is realizing that we are not our egos, right? You are not your ego. What I mean by that is that we start to separate the identity of the I, me, and my, right, from just the everyday personality. And then we start to recognize that we are the awareness behind the ego, right? We are actually the soul, right, which is the seat of consciousness, right? We're conscious that we have an ego, right, and the ego interacts with the rest of the world, but we ourselves are not the ego, right? And this is the great truth of all spiritual practices, right? It always goes back to we are not our bodies, right? We are not our personalities. We are what's behind the personality. We are what's behind the ego. And this is essentially the development of the awakened ego, right? So yes, your ego can become awakened. Your ego can become aware by the fact that it is just a construct of the mind. And in essence, this is the true first step into liberation, right? Is to recognize and realize that your identity is separate from your persona, right? From your personality. And once you recognize this truth, this will be an ego death experience for you. And what I mean by that is that your old self concept will be completely shattered, right? Your old paradigm of how you think about yourself and how you interact with the world will die, right? Essentially, for this new perspective to be born, your old patterns have to die, right? And that's what ego death is all about. It does not mean that your ego is dead, it's completely gone, and it's no longer coming back. It's essentially akin to a death rebirth process, just like in the great tales of the phoenix, right? The mythology of a phoenix is that it dies and it rises from its ashes. This is exactly what happens every time you experience an ego death process. And this is essentially the bread and butter of all spiritual development and transformation, is the process of your ego undergoing a death and rebirth cycle. And if you're lucky and you take your personal development journey very seriously, then you will have many, many opportunities in one single lifetime to die, right? To go through a psychological death, a psychological transformation, and then a psychological rebirth. This is what happens when somebody goes through a really dark and really hard, challenging time of their life. And let's say you haven't seen this person for many, many months or maybe a couple of years. And then you see them, right, for the first time in a long time, and they come back and you notice that they are this completely different person, right? They're almost nothing like the person that you encountered in the past or the person that you thought you knew. And this is essentially what happened is they went through that process. And maybe that's even you, right? Maybe you've yourself gone through that process of complete transformation, and your friends might not even recognize you. They might even expect you to be the sort of person you were that they knew in the past. And as a summary, no, the ego is not automatically bad, right? It's not something that really warrants being killed off, unless, of course, you want to live exactly like Jesus or Buddha and renounce all of your worldly ties, right? And if that's you, hey, listen, good for you. Good job. Keep it up. But I would say for the majority of people, 99.99% of the world, completely killing off your ego makes absolutely no sense, and it's not something that you should be striving for, right? What you want to be ideally striving for is the transformation of your ego, right? Is the transformation of the self, is the transformation of your personality as well, and this goes hand in hand with that, the development of the awareness that you yourself are not your ego, right? The ego is just a construct of your mind. It's a very, very helpful one. It's a very, very useful one, right? But the trouble is that people get too attached to their ego, right? They get too identified with the ego, and they start acting from a place of ego, right? They start acting arrogant. They believe that they are their ego, right? And that nothing else exists beyond their personality, which is false. And again, it is 100% necessary and 100% normal to develop an ego, right? We all need an ego to make our way into this world. Otherwise, we would not even survive. We all need to have an ego to develop safety, right? To develop security and to develop a semblance of awareness of ourself and the outside world. And then, of course, at a certain stage of your life, you start to realize that there is more than your ego, right? There's more inside of you than just your idea of yourself. Right? And that's where your spiritual journey really starts to take off, is when you start to recognize this universal truth. I hope that was helpful for you. I hope that dispelled some very commonly held myths and some misunderstandings of what it means to have an ego and what it means to kill or not to kill your ego. And I hope you have a wonderful and amazing day.